Just starting off with South Africa and looking at all the earnings that we've seen so far, many would say that we've seen a mixed bag. Resources have been the ones that have really come under pressure, and we've also seen pockets of strength. What have you made of the quality of earnings that we've seen so far?
I've actually been quite surprised by the quality. If you go back a few months ago, people were very concerned that the E element of the PE side of things, when you're doing ratings, was actually going to be very, very low. And in fact, it's turned out not to be that way. Yes, as you say, it's been a mixed bag. There have been some very poor earnings coming through, but on the other hand, there have been some very, very good earnings. I'm thinking here of some of the retailers, for example, and particularly the defensive stocks, the food retailers. Excuse me. They've actually been very, very good indeed. So, as I say, a mixed bag. A lot of companies have cautioned that the earnings in the next 6 months, the outlook is not good. And that's interesting because, you know, I think most economists would argue that we're probably now over the worst of the economic cycle, and that we should be looking at the third and fourth quarters to turnarounds. But I think the key here is unemployment. I think that's probably rising further than most people would have anticipated, and it's unfortunately putting a bit of a brake on consumer spending.
Now, you obviously mentioned the word of caution that has been put out by most companies out there. Do you think that the earnings might be worse than what we've seen in the past?
Well, that's what they've been suggesting. And as I come back to this whole bit about unemployment, excuse me, with consumption accounting for about 60% of our economy, it's important that we get back to a reasonable growth rate of around about 3% as quickly as possible, so we can get consumers out there and buying again. Unfortunately, you know, all the indicators are telling us that in fact they're not buying, they're holding back, they're not reducing debt, which is interesting. We saw a couple of weeks ago in the SORB's bulletin that household debt to disposable income is still uncomfortably high at about 76%. So whilst they're not spending, they're not necessarily reducing debt. And it's still a little bit of an uncomfortable situation, yes.
I think another thing that is quite uncomfortable for many stocks out there and many companies out there is, of course, a stronger rand, which is definitely going to impact the likes of resource companies. We've got Sasol releasing today, yep. And we know that Sasol is quite sensitive not only to the oil price, but also to the rand.
Yeah, in fact, Sasol is more sensitive to the rand than it is to the oil price, ironically. Having said that, I mean, Sasol is in an interesting space at this point in time, with the oil price relatively low in that 67, 68 level, and the rand, as you say, being very strong. Sasol currently about 300 rands a share, but earnings going to be down about 40% or thereabouts. But if you look out a year or two, with only a moderate improvement in the oil price, Sasol's prospects, in my opinion, actually look quite good. We're currently on a PE of about, a historic PE of about, what, 13 or thereabouts, moving to about 10 and then about 8 or 9 on a 2-year view. And in my opinion, that's not particularly expensive. So I think it's well positioned, if you like, for a weakening in the rand, which I think is probably going to happen, given the fact that it's been so strong for quite such a long period of time, coupled with the likelihood that the oil price will move up gradually this year and next.
Another thing that is pushing the rand up quite significantly, a lot of talk about MTN and Bharti, and we know that they're going to be concluding their talks by the end of this month. But in the meantime, we've also heard quite a lot of speculation about sweeteners on the deal, and also the fact that they had probably come to some form of agreement. On the other end, we also had the Communications Minister, Siphiwe Nyanda, expressing that he's quite cautious over this deal. Just your views on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's coming out with it's a very understandable view. He's saying, look, we want to keep this thing as South African as possible. But when you put two large groups like this together, you know, is going to dilute the nationalism of the overall thing, if you like. Having said that, I think most of the shareholders out there are relatively keen for this deal to go ahead. But as you rightly say, they're looking for a bit more from Bharti. And Bharti and MTN have both got their funding in place there. But it's quite significant if you look at the kind of moves in the rand. The rand traders are saying, well, you know, there's going to be quite a significant inflow of foreign exchange coming into the country in the wake of this. And the only question remains, how much? How big is it going to be? How much more, if any, is it going to be sweetened from this point in time? But
we're also hearing that the Reserve Bank is probably going to mop up most of those flows to try and avoid any currency fluctuations.
Yes, indeed. I mean, if you look at the rand, it hasn't been particularly volatile. It's been largely a one-way direction, and against not just the dollar, but against the pound and the euro. It's actually been very strong. I think beyond that, that's where we have to look. That's why I said earlier about, in relation to Sasol, I think it's unlikely that we'll see further rand strengthening. I think this is probably as good as it gets.
All right, so we've also got Furst releasing results this week. Your view on that company and what you're expecting, because we've also heard this company obviously under pressure in the past, and also outlook remaining quite cautious. Yeah,
I think analysts are going to be looking at Furst very, very closely indeed, because of all the big four banks. You know, it's had, going back in the past couple of years now, it's had quite a few problems that maybe some of the other banks didn't have. I'm thinking of some of the problems with the private equity operations and things like that. Having said that, I mean, I went to the last presentation and it was quite clear that they really intended to do an awful lot about this. So I think we have to look closely and to see what kind of management actions have taken place with Furst. I think quite a few analysts out there are getting quite bullish on Furst because they see this as being a nice turnaround situation. Look, I think they're very much going to be at the mercy of the same kind of extraneous factors that we see with the Standard, with ABSA, and with Nedbank, in terms of the fact we've got an economy that is not conducive to seeing good retail growth. We're probably going to see further impairments on the retail side, for example. So, you know, all in all, I don't think one should expect a particularly great set of results from Furst, but with that caveat that one should be looking closely at the possibility of a turnaround coming through relatively shortly.